So it is good to see everybody this morning. Welcome to Treasure Hunt. This class we do through the Center of Mindful Living, IMCW's Center for Mindful Living. As you probably know, but may not, in this class we delve into the 2,500-year-old teachings of the early tradition of Buddhism as they're preserved in what's known as the Pali Canon. And these early teachings, they give us the best chance of understanding what the Buddha himself and his early followers thought and taught about how to lead these human lives of ours. And as you've also heard me say, the idea behind this class isn't to become intellectually smart about a set of ancient texts. This is not an abstract or academic exercise. It is to do as best we can, understand the overlap of the path teachings and our own lives. How these teachings help us to negotiate our direct experience, help us to negotiate our lives, and maybe free ourselves up in ways that we didn't realize we could be free. This morning, we're going to get into part 3 and the final part of a teaching, a sutta from the collection called the Anguttara Nikaya, which is translated as, it's called the numbered collection of discourses. And they're numbered in the sense that they're arranged, the teachings are arranged into lists of ones and then twos and threes, on up. This morning's teaching is from a section called the Book of Eights. This is Anguttara Nikaya 8.6, and it's called the Lokadhamma Sutta, which is usually thought of as the teaching on the 8 worldly conditions. And in brief, the 8 worldly conditions are gain and loss, fame and disgrace, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. The teaching goes, and perhaps our direct experience confirms for us that, these 8 conditions, they tend to enchant us and they tend to distress us. And yet, if we're able to relate to them in a wiser way, a more skillful way, it puts us in a position to see clearly because we're not overcome by them. And to provide further context, you might recall that in the introduction of the Satipatthana Sutta, the teaching on the foundations of mindfulness, there's this one phrase at the very beginning of that sutta. It goes something like, a practitioner dwells contemplating, ardent, aware, and mindful, setting aside longing and distress with regard to the world. Now, that last part of the phrase, setting aside longing and distress with regard to the world, that's what this Lokadhamma Sutta is helping us out with. Okay. And just to say, and just to be clear, it's not that we don't care about the world as a result of that. It's not that we don't help out where we can. Instead, we're training ourselves. We're becoming practiced at not tethering our minds, or not tethering our hearts to the way the world is. Not basing our well-being on the way the world acts. Now, I sent out Bhikkhu Sujato's translation of the sutta in the email a couple of days ago, as I have been doing. It's a short teaching, but it's dense with wisdom, and again, just so accurate, I think, in terms of its depiction of this human experience of ours. And so it's justifiably one of the more referred to teachings. And here's the basic outline of what we'll find in the text, what we do find in the text. As I said, the 8 worldly conditions are gain and loss, fame and disgrace, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. The teaching points out that those of us who are both educated and uneducated, taught and untaught, we all encounter these conditions. Now, the difference between the taught and the untaught is that the untaught person does not reflect, does not ponder, that these conditions are impermanent, that they're suffering, that they can't provide satisfaction. And then, because the untaught person does not understand the 8 conditions, those conditions come to occupy the mind of that person. Chitta is the Pali word, that here gets translated as mind, but chitta also refers to that part of our human experience that we call the heart. So what that passage refers to, points to, is how we get, emotionally and intellectually invested in the Lokadhammas. The next part of the teaching is that because the untaught person does not reflect, they go on to favor, gain praise, fame, and pleasure on the one hand, and on the other hand, oppose loss, criticism, disgrace, and pain. And then the untaught person is not freed from suffering, from wandering and anguish. Their mind is not freed. Now, the second part of the teaching simply sets out the flip side of the situation, and that is that the well-taught person does reflect, does understand. Their minds are not occupied, not filled up and concentrated on the 8 conditions. They do not favor and oppose the arising and passing of these conditions, and thus their minds are freed. Now, this portrayal of people, being taught or untaught, as I've said, it sounds dismissive or contemptuous. But I think all it's trying to do is make the distinction between 2 conceptual possibilities. 2 conceptual possibilities that play out, not just between one person and another, but within each of us, from time to time. So there is this perception, which goes something like, how could I not love, gain, praise, and pleasure? The unquestioned assumption there is that those things are innately attractive. And on the other side, there is the perception, how could I not dislike, how could I not oppose loss, criticism, and pain? And the unquestioned assumption there is that they're innately stressful. This whole reference to being taught and untaught, it's not just, it doesn't refer to, who we are as people. It's more about how we're thinking, how we're acting in any moment, or, how we tend to think over time, as a kind of mental habit. So if we're caught in the trap of, this is wrong, how could this be happening, or in particular, how could this be happening to me? Then we're forgetting the facts of life, as the Dhamma might have us, think or point out to us. But we can remind ourselves, we can teach ourselves, we can become taught, and we can make that shift in perception from this is wrong to, of course, this is the way the world is, how could it really be any other way? This realization can take place over time, over a long life of ups and downs, and, getting some perspective, or, these realizations can take place in an instant. In the last 2 classes on this sutta, in November and in December, we covered the first 2 of the conditions, gain and loss. Then we covered the next 4, fame and disgrace, praise and blame. In today's class, we're going to finish up by exploring how the teaching addresses pleasure and pain. Now, pleasure and pain, you might think of them as a catch-all, that the teaching provides us at the end, because if gain and loss, praise and criticism, if they don't account for, all of your issues, you might say, then pleasure and pain will probably do it. Pleasure and pain, that's the thing, isn't it? So these fundamental forces of life, they compel, they dominate, so much of what we see going on in the planet. They occupy the mind, as the sutta says. Pleasure and pain, they occupy a crucial place in human experience. Now, Buddhism, of course, is not the only tradition to try to crack the code on this one. But the Buddha's method, as noted in this sutta, his method is to reflect and to understand that pleasure and pain are impermanent, such that our minds are not occupied and they do not favor and oppose the arising and passing of these things. And thus, the teaching says our minds are free. So reflect and understand. That's something that comes up a lot in the other teachings. It's an important part of this one of the sutta too. This teaching in particular, but also the tradition in general, they have a lot to say about how to relate to and reflect on pleasure and pain, understand them. And I want to take some time and to review some of these other ways, that the early tradition points out to us. Now, some of you, just to start, some of you may remember, some of you may have been here when we covered what is called the Samaditi Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 9. That is translated as the teaching on right view. And one of the aspects of right view is known as paticca samuppada. That's the Pali phrase that's often translated as dependent origination. And it simply refers to conditionality. That is, how and why experience happens the way that it does. I'm not going to get us into that whole teaching. That's a lot, but there are a couple things that I wanted to, from that framework, that I wanted to point out. Just because pleasure and pain, or Vedana, as it's referred to, it sits at a critical point in that teaching. So the part of paticca samuppada that I want to point out this morning is first that the teaching says that we experience contact at any one of the 6 sense gates. We experience contact, at eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Mind is the 6th sense in Buddhism. The Pali word for the sense contact is phassa. Okay, next, based on contact, we have the experience of pleasant, painful, or neutral. Again, the Pali word is Vedana, usually translated as feeling. After contact, after feeling, there's another step. A step that usually happens, but doesn't have to happen. And that is that we crave. And the Pali word for craving is tanha, literally means thirst. The tendency, the tradition points out, the latent tendency that we have is that we crave for pleasant experience to arise and to stay. And we crave for painful experience to go away and to stay away. And neutral feeling we tend to ignore. After craving, we typically take another step, and that is that we cling, we grasp, we become identified with experience. And there the Pali word is upadana. And once we become identified, we create a realm of being, a realm of existence. The Pali word there is bhava. And the last part of the sequence that I want to point out is that, after or within this realm of existence, we take birth. We live a particular life, stake out a particular position, a particular posture within that realm of existence. The Pali word there is jati. Jati, by the way, is the word that gets translated as caste. Okay. So the sequence going back to sense contact, and feeling, it unfolds very quickly. It unfolds many, many times, and we create many worlds and we live many lives, you may have noticed. For example, someone makes a rude remark to us, or they criticize us, and think of how quickly we create a mental world in which the other person is a jerk and we're a victim in our life. And those moments collapses down into, an internal or an external dialogue about how we're right, they're wrong. This happens a lot. It's a sequence that happens often very automatically, often by default. And it hinges on that latent tendency to crave for pleasure to come and crave for pain to go. Now, in terms of our practice, in terms of how we might reflect and understand this, we can do our best to keep this sequence in mind, and carry it around with us, so to speak, be on guard for it. But, that can be, maybe that's not the best use of our time and mind all the time. In my own experience, it's more often the case that, I find myself caught in some particular mental world and I have to say, wow, how did I get here? But whatever the case, it can be helpful to follow the trail of breadcrumbs, back to the root pleasure that I was trying to get at, or, what was I grasping at or trying to avoid? At that point, it can be very interesting and very useful to take up, the specific nature of the pleasure or the pain, as a theme of contemplation. And by regularly engaging in this kind of reflection, this kind of practice, we can start to disjoin Vedana from tanha. We can disjoin feeling from craving. So this leads me to another well-known teaching called the Salata Suta. This is often thought of as the teaching on the two arrows. And in it, the Buddha makes a crucial observation. He says, I'm going to quote a little bit. When an uninstructed person experiences painful physical feelings, they experience two feelings, physical and mental. It is like a person who is struck with an arrow only to be struck by a second arrow. That person experiences the feeling of two arrows. And he goes on later and says, sensing a feeling of pleasure, the uninstructed one senses it as though joined with it. Sensing a feeling of pain, the uninstructed one senses it as though joined with it. But a fundamental part of this path is to clearly comprehend our tendencies, our habits, and then work to dislodge ourselves from them. And here are the results described later in the sutta. The Buddha says, sensing a feeling of pleasure, the well-instructed one senses it, disjoined from it. Feeling a sense of pain, the well-instructed one senses it, disjoined from it. He is disjoined, I tell you, from suffering and stress. So it's interesting what the Buddha is describing, at this critical moment in our experience is actually a form of non-yoga, of a form of disunion. So the Buddha has us disentangle, that which we habitually join. He has us disjoin what we habitually perceive to be inseparable, perceived to be innately bound together. And the habit is that happiness is joined with pleasure and unhappiness is joined with pain. Now, absent any sort of revelation, it can be the working assumption of our life that happiness is the same as pleasure and unhappiness is the same as pain. So in order to be happy, we seek pleasure. And in order to dispel unhappiness, we seek the absence of pain, or we set our sights on material pleasure. Now, the first time I remember having this fundamental assumption shaken up was as a kid. You might have heard me tell this story before. I grew up in Dallas, and a group of us were walking to school. We were all in junior high at the time, and it was really cold for Dallas, that is. Now, most of us were, really complaining, and frankly, getting pretty spastic about how cold it was. But this one kid, Jeff Dover was his name, as we were complaining, he kind of matter-of-factly said, you can be cold and suffer, or you can just be cold. You can be cold and suffer, or you can just be cold. And I remember even as a kid experiencing a little shift in perspective. It was like, whoa, where did he get that? Cold and suffering are not the same thing. And just one other story. This one comes from my daughter, Sonia, who, when she was at Rutgers, she somewhat outed herself as a Buddhist, which was pretty much of an oddity in that location. But the story is that, Sonia and a friend of hers were walking home late one night, and Sonia's friend, Carly, her high heels were starting to give her a hard time. And she was getting blisters on her heels. And apparently Carly started to, really complain, and she got pretty dramatic at one point. And she was like, I can't do this. I can't walk anymore. And Sonia said something like, Carly, it's just pain. It's just a sensation. And then Carly paused, and Sonia said she got this look of realization on her face. And she said, oh my God, Sonia, you're like a Buddhist Jesus. I can walk again. I can walk again. So the point of these stories, is that we can experience these paradigm shifts. Something that we thought was an immutable fact of life, it can just melt away. And in this case, we can have the direct experience of what the Buddhists are fond of saying, and that is that, pain is a given, suffering is optional. We can disjoin pain from suffering. We can disrupt the unfolding of events, outlined in dependent origination, and not get caught in that mental world, created that might typically get created by pleasure and pain. I want to review a few more sections from the Salata Suta, from the two arrows. So there's that part of the sutta which makes it justifiably famous, the possibility of not layering one kind of pain on top of another, the possibility of not harming ourselves with, a second arrow. But there's another part of the sutta that points to how we get there. And here's a passage from that. It says, the well-instructed person discerns, truly understands, as it is actually present, the origination of feeling, the passing away of feeling, the allure of feeling, the drawback, and the escape from feeling. So this is one of those sections, where there's a lot going on. First we discern as it is present, in the moment. The origination and passing away of Vedana, how feelings come and how feelings go. And then we go on to understand the allure. What makes a feeling enticing? Something that we go after. So when we're practicing with something like this, we can be clear, we can be honest about what we're drawn to. Why are we drawn to a particular pleasure or pain? Next, we can discern the drawback. We can reflect on the downside of continuing down a particular path, reflect on the downside of falling in with the allure. And then we can discern the escape from the feeling, how to free ourselves, how to become disjoined. So that's 5 facets to contemplate. And so I want to offer you a few more thoughts about, these facets, coming at them from different angles. So here are a few passages and other teachings that describe the impermanent nature of feeling, how fickle they are, how they come and go. In Samyutta Nikaya 36:12, in a sutta called The Sky, feelings are compared to various kinds of wind. They come from different directions. They're clear. The winds are clear or filled with dust, and the winds could be warm or they could be cold. And in a sutta called The Guest House, feelings are compared to different kinds of people, who come to visit the house. They come from different directions. They bring with them certain kinds of belongings. They stay for a while and then they leave. And here's an interesting one. In Majjhima Nikaya 44, there's a nun named Dhammadina. And she notes that pleasant is pleasant when present. And as it vanishes, it becomes painful. Pain is pain when present, but as it vanishes, it becomes pleasant. Isn't that an interesting one, right? It's like that last bite of ice cream is painful, right? And the end of being sick is pleasurable. Kind of funny how this works, right? So sometimes just being clear for ourselves that some kind of pleasure or pain is impermanent is enough to free us, is enough to free us up. But in other cases, even if we fully admit that feelings are impermanent, the Buddha points out that they still have their allure. The Buddha is not saying that a good meal tastes bad. It does taste good. It is pleasurable. And there are an endless number of things that do provide, some measure of pleasure. But the Buddha would also have us consider the costs of falling in with the allure. Generally speaking, one of the costs of falling in with the allure of sense desire is the mental and physical effort it takes to map out, and to cobble together all those pieces and parts. Cobble together all of the worldly conditions such that we get a steady supply of pleasant experience. I know, speaking for myself, it's quite sobering sometimes to reflect on how much of my mental life, is or could be given over to this. When I taught Buddhism to kids, I had a prop that I'd use every now and then, and it was a big glass jar that I'd fill with water. And what I'd do is I'd pour in a bunch of red and blue plastic beads. And then I'd stir the beads up and have the kids imagine that the red beads were like pain and that the blue beads were like pleasure. And that the pleasure and pain, they come and go, they swirl around in our lives, just like the beads were swirling around. And the next thing I did was put in a little rubber goldfish, put the rubber goldfish into the jar. And I'd have the kids imagine that the goldfish was trying to grab the blue beads and stay away from the red ones. So the goldfish is in there swirling around with the beads, chasing the blue and avoiding the red. And one little girl, her name was Rosie. She was really looking at that goldfish and got this really concerned frown on her face. She was really empathizing with that toy goldfish, in a way that only a kid can empathize with a toy goldfish. And then I asked the kids, how do you think this goldfish feels? And Rosie immediately said, anxious. Right? So Rosie was cluing into the drawback. And we might see how this is true in our life too. Anxiety is the price we pay for attaching our well-being to the coming and going, the swirling around of pleasure and pain. Now, even if we're in a position to keep the conveyor belt of pleasure going, it's good to ask ourselves, if that's the kind of mental habit we want to get into. Do we really want to set ourselves up to run on that hamster wheel? Besides the fact that it's exhausting, I perceive it sometimes to be not very dignified. It's not the highest thing that I want for myself. So seeing in this way, framing things in this way for ourselves allow us to discern, the drawbacks, which can lead us quite naturally to not want to do this to ourselves, which is essentially also the escape that the sutta refers to. One leads quite naturally to the other. Here's another angle on this subject. This is from Anguttara Nikaya 9:14. And in it, one of the Buddha's disciples, the Venerable Samidi, uh, he points out that thoughts and intentions have feelings as their meeting place. Thoughts and intentions have pleasure and pain as their meeting place. Another translation is that feeling is where thoughts and intentions converge. So what this is pointing out to us is how our thoughts and intentions are so often centered, around the fundamental questions of what feels good, what feels bad. Now, in contemplating, Vedana, we're pulling back the curtain on some of the fundamental, motivations behind human actions. Our own actions internally and the actions of the world, externally. So if we use Venerable Samadi's realization, as we reflect in our practice, it can help us to cut through what might be an amorphous fog of thoughts and intentions, right? And we can thereby become clear about what our thoughts and intentions are really aimed at. We can become clear for ourselves. What is it that we're wanting? Because, do you have those mind states, those trains of thought that, might follow you around a bit, that don't go away? Maybe they feel a little obsessive. The mind feels really compelled by something. Well, we can ask questions of ourselves, what's the gratification that I'm seeking out? What's the exact nature of the pleasure that I'm aiming for? Or what is the exact nature of the pain that I'm trying to avoid? Layer after layer. It can take time, like pulling back the layers of an onion. Sometimes this can be embarrassing, to admit what we're being drawn to, or it can be, embarrassing to admit what, we're afraid of. So this is where practice, it might take a little bit of courage. All this being said, I do want to point out that, for us lay folks, the Buddha was kind of relaxed about mundane pleasure. I'm teaching you, I'm sharing something that the Buddha would have taught to the monastics. But for us lay folks, as long as we don't get immoderate about it, right? It's okay for us to go ahead and enjoy the fruits of our labors, and share it with others. That's okay. That's okay. But even though we may not be monastics, we'll still benefit from trying to keep our balance. We'll still benefit from maintaining our dignity and our composure. And not letting ourselves get as invested as all the enticements around us would have us get. And also, as lay people, the path would have us not neglect the kinds of pleasure and happiness that we can make for ourselves within. I think this is pretty important. It's very important, actually. The Buddha is not just pointing out what we should not do. He's not just pointing out what gets us into trouble. He also points out what helps us. What really, really helps us. So another way, another crucial way to escape the habit of seeking mundane pleasure is to make other means of satisfaction available to us. right? And this is where spiritual pleasure comes into play. And if it's not clear already, just to say the Buddha was not against pleasure wholesale. In Buddhism, pleasure is not always pathological. The Buddha was definitely not against happiness. But the Buddha did recommend that we reset our priorities or consider our priorities so that we're aiming at beneficial kinds of pleasure and happiness. For example, this is from the Dhammapada. It's verse 290. It goes, if by giving up a lesser happiness, one could experience greater happiness, a wise person would renounce the lesser to behold the greater. That's all renunciation is. In the Buddhist tradition, at least, it's not about denying ourselves pleasure. Instead, it's about, raising our standard. It's about trading up. And what this passage from the Dhammapada points out is how wisdom can lead us to greater, more reliable kinds of pleasure. Safer pleasures because they're found within. So just some examples, spiritual pleasure comes from a mind that's calm and composed, rather than wandering and agitated. It comes from a mind that's assured of its own integrity. We really do trust that we're trying to be a decent person. It comes from a mind that's infused with the Brahma Viharas, right? Heaven-like, minds that are infused with a heaven-like goodwill and compassion. That pleasure, this kind of pleasure can come from a mind that's generous and appreciative, that steers itself towards gratitude. So we can make these states of mind happen, and they're pleasurable, and they're an alternative to getting caught in and weighed down by trivial types of pleasure. In the overall scope of the teachings, they're not something that we're simply supposed to watch and let them arise and pass away. Instead, we're intended to nurture them, bring them about, make them strong, make them reliable. I'm gonna start to wrap it up here a little bit. Just two more things I want to put into your brains, or maybe put into your hearts. Just ending, going back to the Lokadhamma Sutta itself again. It says these 8 worldly conditions revolve around the world, and the world revolves around these 8 worldly conditions. For both the uninstructed and the well-instructed, there arise gain and loss, praise and criticism, fame and disgrace, pleasure and pain. What is the difference between the uninstructed and the well-instructed? An uninstructed person welcomes the gain and is repelled by the loss, welcomes the praise and is repelled by the criticism, welcomes the fame and is repelled by the disgrace, welcomes the pleasure and is repelled by the pain. But for the well-instructed person, these conditions do not obsess the mind. And to get us to the very, very end, I want to share a story. And it comes from an event last summer, the very end of last summer. my office, I work as an architect, so this is a bunch of architects. We went on a sailboat in Annapolis. We rode on a schooner. And so our crew of three, sailed us out into the bay. It was a beautiful, warm, sunny day. And I was really enchanted with how the crew worked the boat. So everyone else is talking and drinking and snacking, and I'm looking at the boat. I'm looking at the crew. But the part of the part of all that that's relevant, the part that I thought was amazing, was that when we started to sail back into the harbor at the end of the day, and we were sailing against the wind. Right? Now, I knew that sailboats could do that, but to be on a boat and having the wind blow one way and the boat go another, I hadn't been on a sailboat really, but so to have that felt sense, that direct experience, it was simply amazing to me. And I still have this image in my head, of the big billowing white sails, against the, with the crisp blue sky in the background. And on top of the main mast was a red flag. And that red flag was blowing really hard. It was really whipping around. That red flag was blowing one way, and the sailboat was going another way. And I was just mesmerized looking at this miracle. Now, for those of you who know about sailboats, the reason that a sailboat can go against the wind is because it has a keel. Right? It has some kind of big fin underneath it that guides the boat through the water, and helps steer the boat in directions other than the winds would normally push the boat. Right? And that's the point of this story, the Dhamma is our keel. Okay? The Dhamma helps us chart a course that goes in a different direction than how the worldly conditions, how the worldly winds might have us go. Okay, so that's what I want to leave you with, is that the Dhamma is our keel.